Afternoon, everyone. This is the July 25th, 2023 meeting of the City Finance Committee. And before we do the roll call, I just have an announcement. We're having slight technical issues with the Zoom. So there is audio only on Zoom. However, if you want to watch video and you're at home, you can watch YouTube, which will have the video. But if you want to speak, you would still need to register through Zoom. So you'd have to toggle back and forth between the two. But otherwise, Zoom does have the audio, and that is how you would be able to speak. And apologize for the inconvenience on that. So with that, may we have a roll call, please?
Yes. Committee Member Alejandro Gutierrez is not present. Committee Member Harmon?
Here.
Committee Chair Friedman?
Here. Thank you. So on our first item, well, actually, we need to do general public comment. Are there any members of the public who wish to speak to an item not on today's agenda, but under the purview of the Finance Committee? Not seeing any here. Are there any online? Please raise your hand in the app.
Chair Friedman, we don't have anybody online who would like to speak.
I will close general public comment, and now I will turn it over item 1, which is a loan to the Turner Foundation for the property at 2011 Oak Avenue. And Ms. Doubles, you're up.
Thank you, Chair Friedman and Committee Member Harmon. I'm Laura Doubles, and I'm the Housing and Human Services Manager for the city. Thank you for the opportunity to present to you today the Turner Foundation acquisition of property located at 2011 Oak Avenue. And on the screen is our staff recommendation. To summarize, staff is requesting that you review and recommend that the council introduce and adopt an ordinance approving a loan agreement to the Turner Foundation in the amount of $457,500 for the acquisition of the real property. And it is to be used for low-income transitional age youth housing. It will be secured by a deed of trust and a new 90-year affordability control covenant. And we ask for authorization for our director to also execute such agreements as necessary. Next slide, please. We also request approval to subordinate all of the city's documents to the State of California HCD department, as well as the County of Santa Barbara. And that will put us into a junior position behind them. And as well as authorizing our director to execute a formal reservation of funding letter that is required by state HCD and needs to be presented as part of the Home Key project application. Next slide, please. The Turner Foundation and the County of Santa Barbara will be the co-applicants applying for the state HCD Home Key Round 3 funds in order to acquire the property. Staff is proposing that the city provide half of the match requirement of the program, which is the $457,500. And the property will provide permanent housing units to transitional age youth, which is a population between the ages of 18 and 24 who are either currently homeless or at risk of homelessness. Next slide, please. The property consists of 8 one-bedroom units that will be restricted to low income, 80% AMI and below. And the program participants will be provided permanent supportive services to ensure their success. Next slide, please. This is a picture of the property currently. And the Turner Foundation has been a city partner for many years. They have a 65-year track record of providing low-income housing with supportive services. Today we have Mavel Tortolito, the Director of Youth and Community Programs here, as well as Donnie Feller, the Director of Operations, in support of the project. Back in 2020, they launched the Foundation House program to help transitional age youth and stabilize their housing situations. They partner with Channel Islands YMCA to provide weekly case management to the participants of the program. Next slide, please. So we have a very tight deadline. This Friday is the deadline date, July 28th, but a home key application will be submitted with both the Turner Foundation and the County of Santa Barbara as co-applicants for acquisition and operating costs of approximately $3.1 million. $915,000 is the required matching funds component of the program, and the county and city has agreed to split that 50-50. So each will be providing $457,500. And the County Board of Supervisors just approved that last Tuesday, the 18th. The state is requiring the funding reservation letter, and if we approve this proposal, we can submit that as well with the application. Next slide, please. So this will be given in a proposed loan. Funding will come from our home ARP fund, which was given to the county as entitlement for being a home jurisdiction. And we were given that through the American Rescue Plan that U.S. Congress adopted back in 2021. That $457,500 will be provided in a residual receipts loan, which is a very common affordable housing mechanism for repayment, where staff will review annually the financials of the project, and when or if there is a positive cash flow, that will trigger a payment to be made for the next 12 months. This will be given as a 30-year term, 4.5% simple interest, and the maturity date will be November 2053. Next slide, please. We will be recording a new city 90-year covenant on the property to restrict it to low income, 80% AMI and below. And this is an excellent opportunity to add affordable housing units to our city portfolio. The cost that will be incurred for the city will be approximately $57,000, which compared to an amount of a little over $700,000 to develop brand new units, that's a real opportunity for us. Next slide, please. So under the Home Key program, there will be a few contract elements that I need to go over. The state HCD will record a 55-year covenant that will require that supportive housing element to it. And the county, as the co-applicant, is requiring to be put in senior lien position. So that will require the city to agree to subordinate to all state and county documents on title. Next slide, please. And in summary, this opportunity, as I mentioned, adds more units to our portfolio at a very low cost per unit. And it's an excellent partnership with both state HCD and the County of Santa Barbara. It also will assist our at-risk and currently homeless, transitional age youth population to secure needed housing to stabilize them, and also provide supportive services to help ensure their success. Next slide, please. And with that, I'm back to the staff recommendation. I'm here if there's any questions, as well as our two people from the Turner Foundation as well. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ms. Doubles, for the presentation. And any questions? I have two quick questions for you. One is, the project is great overall, but on our regional housing needs numbers that were assigned, would these 8 units go to us, or would they be split between us and the county?
Thank you, Chair Friedman. That is a good question. We would actually count them, but I'm not too sure of the answer to that.
But
I apologize.
Overall, we would get either maybe half or full
Yeah.
towards our numbers, so this would help us
Absolutely.
meet our numbers as well.
Right,
Okay.
for sure.
And then my other, just quick other question is, the state has a covenant of supportive housing for 55, and we have it for 90 for affordable. So at year 55, it would still require to be affordable, but the supportive services technically might not be there, but they could continue.
That's correct,
Okay,
yes.
thank you.
And back to your first question, I just thought about it. It would be our RENA numbers because it is within our city.
Okay, great, even better. All right, thank you. I'll now open it up to public comment. Are there any members of the public who wish to speak to this item? Please raise your hand in the app. I don't see any in the chambers. Are there any?
Chair Friedman, we do not have any speakers for this item.
Okay, I will close public comment. And are there any comments and need a motion? Member Harmon.
Thank you, Chair Friedman. No comments other than to say this is really exciting. This is our favorite thing to do, really, at Finance Committee. So thank you for bringing this to us. And thank you to the Turner Foundation for what you'll be doing. It's much needed in our community. So very excited and happy, Chair Friedman, to move staff recommendation.
All right, I will second the motion and just want to say appreciate you bringing this forward. Definitely supportive. I'm glad the county was able to get this on their agenda as well. It serves one of the toughest populations to actually find housing for in that age group, and some of the most vulnerable as well, being that they're transitional youth and many times don't have a lot of family or other supportive services. And the partnership with the YMCA and the new facility they have will be great to have that and to be able to get them the stability that they need for that age group. So with that, any other comments? If not, may I get, the motion's been made and seconded. Do we need to do a roll call on this one, or can we just do? Okay, all in favor? Aye. Any opposed? None. Abstentions? None. It passes unanimously. Thank you. And now we are on to item 2, which is the reserve policy discussion and direction. I'll turn that over to Mr. DiMartini.
Thank you very much, Chair Freeman. My name is Keith DiMartini. I'm the city's finance director, and I'll be presenting an overview of the city's reserve policy to the Finance Committee today. The objective of this presentation is to obtain the Finance Committee's direction regarding staff's recommended changes to Resolution Number 22-126, which established the city's reserve policies. Let me start by providing an overview as to why the city has a reserve policy in the first place. The first thing I'll say is that there really are no legal requirements. There's no government code section, there's no legal requirement that says a city needs to have a reserve policy at any certain level for any certain purpose. There are industry and government standards, however, and best practices, which staff review and update and provide information publicly into the city council, especially during the budget process. And this slide summarizes the major reasons as to why the city of Santa Barbara has a reserve policy. These issues are addressed in the current reserve policy, and our reserve policy as a city does meet the government standards and best practices set forth mostly with GFOA, which is the Government Finance Officers Association. First and foremost, reserves provide financial stability to our organization. They provide stability when our revenues might be volatile, when we might incur additional expenditures above and beyond what is planned. It's a safety net, it's a bank account, which we are able to access to allow us to continue to provide services to the community. They're resources that we have available in times of distress. When we have disasters, we have a track record of having to deal with natural disasters such as storms, COVID, the Thomas Fire, any sort of unforeseen events. Those reserves have been utilized to allow us to continue to provide services to the community and incur additional expenses to address those disasters. It also allows us to smooth revenue volatility. So 2 of our major general fund revenue sources, transient occupancy tax and sales tax, are rather volatile. They go up and down as the economy goes ups and down, and much more volatile than, say, property tax. So when we have volatile revenue, those reserves are utilized when those reserves are a bit lower. Having a strong reserve policy allows the city to achieve an advantageous credit rating. A credit rating is important because it tells the marketplace that we have strong financial practices, strong budgetary practices. We take our money seriously. And what it does ultimately is it allows us to issue debt and borrow money, what the city does fairly regularly, at favorable borrowing terms. So it's actually more cost effective, it's cheaper in the long run to be able to borrow money when we have a good credit rating. And then finally, the city council from time to time will appropriate money out of reserves for projects and for other types of needs that come up during the year that may not have been thought of or really talked about during the annual budget process. There's examples of that occur throughout the year. One example that occurred last year was council gave direction to staff to begin a short-term rental enforcement program. That was about $1 million that was appropriated using general fund reserves for a program that is one-time in nature that was not discussed during sort of the annual budget process. So that's an example when reserves are utilized for something that does come up during the year. This slide here summarizes the major components of the city's existing reserve policy. First, this item is before you today that as direction was received from the city council during the budget deliberation meeting held in June. The Finance Committee directed that staff bring this item to the Finance Committee as part of a larger effort under the Fiscal Sustainability Initiative and Vision 2030 as a plan to replenish reserves as part of the upcoming next 2-year financial plan starting in fiscal year 2026. So we're here today as a sort of the first step of that process. Our reserve policy dictates a 10% contingency reserve and a 15% disaster reserve policy target for a total of 25%. That 25% is 25% of the next fiscal year's expenditure budget, okay? So if next fiscal year's expenditure budget is $100, the reserve policy target says we should have $25 in the bank. The most recent projection that staff consolidated in last fiscal year, in fiscal year 2023, as of the Q3 report, show that we were projecting to be below the policy target of approximately $5.3 million. Now, we'll have the Q4 numbers, bringing that to Finance Committee. It's scheduled to come in September. So we'll have an update for you in about a month and a half, and we'll see where we end up as of the end of fiscal year 2023. The reserve policy also states that any use of reserves requires a majority of vote of the City Council, and that vote should come with an assessment of the fiscal condition of the general fund or any fund where you might be below a reserve policy target. It should also indicate what is the balancing strategy. What really is the plan to replenish those reserves over a certain period of time so that the city can meet the City Council's policy reserve target. It's important to note that the city did recently make a substantial update to its reserve policies not too long ago. So back in December of 2022, so just about 7 or 8 months ago, this reserve policy was updated. And these are the major updates that were made to that reserve policy. The one at the top is the most significant item. So instead of any year-end general fund surplus going towards capital, instead of that 50% going to capital, instead 50% will be going towards reducing the city's pension liability and its annual pension expenditure burden. But not just in the general fund, because every fund bears the burden of the city's unfunded actuarial liability for pensions, so that will be a proportional share across all of the funds where that liability exists. So that update was made, along with rescinding a number of individual reserve policy resolutions so that we truly have one consolidated citywide reserve policy. That's what Resolution 22-126 established. There were also some updates to enterprise fund capital reserves. The reserve policy also has language in there about considering opening up a line of credit in times of a disaster. So there are financing tools available to us if we wanted to reconsider the level of disaster reserves, for example, and opening up a line of credit. And then we also increased the appropriated reserve level from $150,000 to $250,000. As part of this presentation, staff felt it was important to provide some benchmarking comparison information to the Finance Committee so you can see what other cities have done. As I mentioned earlier, there is no prescribed method. There is no government code requirement. It truly is up to the governing body of each city to determine what is the appropriate level of reserves for that organization. On the far left bar, you'll see Santa Barbara at 25%. And then you can see what many other cities across California have as their reserve policy target. The source of this data came from a survey that was conducted from the California Society of Municipal Financial Advisors, and it was gathered around 5 years ago. So it is a bit dated. Reserve policies do change from time to time, but you can see that our reserve policy at 25 is slightly above the average of 22.9% for this group of survey respondents. Most cities have anywhere between a 2 to 3 month reserve amount. So a 2-month reserve amount is around 16 or 17%. The 3-month reserve amount is around 25%, which is where we are at. You can see most cities are around that level. Staff wanted to provide more updated information to the Finance Committee today, and we also wanted to make sure that we included cities that we would typically compare ourselves to for lots of different reasons. So staff went and did this research and came up with this list. These are cities that are more centrally located to us, ones that have similar types of operations, full service cities. Many of these are, not all of them. And you can see that the average for this sampling of cities is exactly what our policy is at 25%. But again, you can see some that are lower and you can see some that are higher. So now staff wanted to provide the trend of our general fund reserves over the past, really the past 18 or so years with a projection into the next couple of years. And the committee has seen this slide before. We presented this slide a number of times. The red line is the target reserve policy at 25% in dollars. And then the gray bars show what our actual reserves have been over those years and what they're projected to be going forward. And you can see during the Great Recession in fiscal year 2008, 2009, the city substantially used reserves during that time. And then over the course of the next 8 or so fiscal years, those reserves were gradually replenished. And the way that that occurs is by achieving savings, by achieving surpluses in each of those annual operating years so that we deposit more money into those reserves. That's what occurred over an 8-year period to eventually achieve the reserve policy target. And then COVID hit. We dipped into reserves substantially in fiscal year 20, and then again in fiscal year 21. What council took decisive action in fiscal year 21 by allocating the entire first tranche of the ARPA legislation directly into the general fund to replace all of the revenue that we lost from sales tax, TOT, departmental fees and services into the general fund. And that really helped sustain our operation going forward. But we do have our challenges going forward, as you can see, in the current fiscal year and fiscal year 24 and beyond, with annual operating deficits projected, requiring the use of reserves to balance the budget going forward. Staff does have one recommendation that we're bringing to you today in regards to our reserve policy, and that is in regards to the Harbor Preservation Fund. This is a separate fund that's established within the Waterfront Department, and the ordinance that was adopted requires that a reserve level no less than $2 million with a goal of $5 million be established to be able to facilitate capital improvement projects at the waterfront. The Harbor Preservation Fund has approximately $2 million in it as of today. The waterfront also has its own capital fund as well, which does not have that much money in it. And so what staff is proposing to do is to rescind that ordinance, which will require a vote of the city council to be able to do so. And if council agrees to do that, we would then transfer that $2 million in the Harbor Preservation Fund into the Waterfront Capital Fund so that the Waterfront Department can more effectively manage their capital improvement program out of one fund, which is very similar to how all of the other major enterprises manage their capital program as well. And then the existing language in the reserve policy will govern how that fund gets replenished. And the way that the capital funds for the enterprises get replenished and managed today is that they base that on at least 5% of their capital asset valuation or an average of their planned capital improvement program over the next 3 fiscal years. Because the way that capital projects get programmed and implemented, it's a cycle. They come and go. Some years are very, very large capital expenditures. Some years there may be very less. And so a forward-looking, outward-looking approach to managing capital, staff believes is a more effective way to do so. So that is the one staff recommended request to the Finance Committee today. So what considerations might the Finance Committee have in regards to any potential changes you might like to make to the reserve policy? This slide here summarizes many of them, but there may be more. First, you could consider adjusting the contingency reserve percent. Again, right today it's 10%. You could also consider adjusting the disaster reserve percent. Again, today it's 15%. You could also request staff to consider other reserve requirements for capital. Maybe the target shouldn't be so high for capital reserves, or maybe there's direction you want to give to staff about how much general fund money or Measure C money or other resources we might have for capital as opposed to other functions. It truly is important to understand what impacts other funds have on the general fund when making this decision. And there are 2 funds I'd like to highlight. First is the city's self-insurance fund, which we've talked about at great detail in the Finance Committee. The self-insurance fund funds many of our insurance premiums, our insurance programs, and any claims that we might have to pay out. The fund is currently underfunded based on the most recent actuarial reports that we receive. And so we are ramping up allocations into that fund over multiple years. But because that fund is underfunded, the general fund and other funds do bear some of the burden on that underfunded position. And then the other fund I'd like to highlight is the downtown parking fund, right? As we've talked about during budget presentations with City Council, that fund is projected to be well below its reserve policy target by the end of this current fiscal year and into next fiscal year, and will be close to depleting nearly all of their reserves within the next 1 to 2 years, unless other operational changes occur. So again, because that fund is underfunded, the general fund does have some burden on it to be able to make sure that that fund can continue to operate. I talked about potential delaying of capital improvement program projects as sort of a consideration here as well. The reserve policy today does have language in it about considering a line of credit, and that is an opportunity for the city to consider. And effectively what that would do is it would open up this line of credit with a bank that we would have a relationship with. And in the event of an emergency, for example, we would have immediate access to that cash to be able to use to see us through a disaster. And if we established that line, we then wouldn't necessarily need to have all of that cash in our reserves to meet the 15% disaster reserve target. Now, that is not a widely sort of used tool across many cities, but it is something that we could definitely explore. And then finally, it's important to note any potential credit or bond rating impacts that we might have with any change to the reserve policy. There isn't necessarily a direct correlation between how high or low our reserve policy target is to how advantageous a credit rating might be. There isn't really a direct correlation, but it is one consideration. It's one factor that rating agencies use when evaluating our position. And as the committee is aware, we are planning to issue a rather large debt issuance within the next 12 months, maybe even less, in preparation for the new police headquarter building. So that is one consideration for you in making any changes to the reserve policy. So with that, our request to the Finance Committee is to receive your direction on any potential changes you'd like to see on the reserve policy. And then we are also recommending that you recommend to the full City Council introducing and then subsequently adopting the ordinance amending the Santa Barbara Municipal Code by repealing Chapter 17.40, pertaining to the Harbor Preservation Fund. And with that, we'll open it up to any questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. DiMartini, for the presentation. There's a lot to this. It's important recommendations and that we will be discussing, and these would get forwarded to council eventually. So open up to questions from my colleagues. Member Harmon.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. DiMartini. I really appreciate it, and appreciate the way this was laid out. I think I just have a couple of questions. On slide 6 with this reserve target comparison, if I'm understanding correctly, these are just the cities that responded. Okay, so there's no, like, we're not saying that these are our equivalent cities, it's just the info we have.
Yeah, Committee Member Harmon, that's correct. It's the cities that voluntarily responded to this survey. And because we knew that this list was rather incomplete, right? We wanted to see cities that's why we then presented slide 7, which is mostly cities that we would typically compare ourselves to.
Okay, cool. That's very, very helpful information. I guess the information that I'm sort of trying to wrap my head around is for the disaster reserve, so we have 15%. Has there been any time in the last, say, 10 years where we've had it, so I ask this because we've had a couple of disasters, right, that have been hugely impactful. Has there been any time that we have fully depleted that 15%? So we've gone down to 0, we've had to use it all. And if the answer is no, which I think it is, and you might not have the answer to this right now, but what is sort of the average diminution of that fund when we have a disaster?
Yes, Committee Member Harmon. So I can say with certainty that we have never fully depleted our disaster reserves as an organization. Thank goodness. I'll refer to slide 8, which does show our reserve policy level. This is both. And so maybe as an improvement for next time, I can delineate between disaster and contingency for sure. The way in which reserves do get used is we always dip into contingency reserves first, then we dip into disaster reserves. And what I can say in fiscal year 2008 is that the gap between the red line and the gray column is the amount of contingency reserves. So we did about fully deplete the contingency reserves in 2008, and then we did so again in fiscal year 2021. Before the ARPA legislation was passed by the federal government, we had, there was a period of time, about a couple of months, where we had fully depleted the contingency reserves, and we had dipped into the disaster reserves slightly in that fiscal year.
Thank you, that's very helpful. That's it for questions, Chair. I'll save the rest for comments.
Member Gutierrez.
Yes. Mr. DiMartini, the line of credit, can you give examples of disasters you mentioned? And is the line of credit, you said that not all cities use this, but can you just give us a little bit more example on the line of credit? Just because if I'm thinking, why would the city get a line of credit when we're already in the negatives? How would we pay it back? But this is just me being new to finance. If you could just give us more examples on why that would be an option.
Yes, Committee Member Gutierrez would be happy to. So a line of credit would be, it gives us an ability of tapping into cash that's held at a bank in times of a disaster. So there are entities, public entities out there that have this. Many of them are much larger than us, or they're an enterprise, like a water district or a transportation district. And many of them have this. And so if there's an event that occurs that disrupts the flow of water or the transportation system, they're able to tap into resources immediately and use that cash for repair work. We could do something similar here in the event of a disaster. There is a one-time cost of opening up a line of credit. So we'd have to go through a process. Council would have to approve of us doing so. We'd have to effectively shop around for what would be the appropriate line for us, how much it would cost, and then it would be established. Then, when a disaster occurs, we would contact the bank, we would get that cash immediately and then start using it, and then we would have to pay it back over time with an interest rate. So it does cost us more money, right? It's like paying down your mortgage or paying down a loan. But what it does do is it frees up the city from having to have all of that cash in our bank today and just sitting there. Now, that money isn't just sitting there doing nothing, right? We are investing it. We are very restricted on what we can invest that money on because the purpose of our investment policy is to make sure that that cash is available, that it's safe and secure and readily usable. But it would free us up from just having that money sit there. So there's sort of pros and cons to be thinking about.
Thank you for that clarification. Just because every time you would say disasters, I think, well, the disasters we had, yes, it's very common for our area, but hopefully we won't have these disasters in a short period of time. But since we live in an area where water is always an issue, and hopefully it's not going to be an issue in a couple of years, but thank you, that makes a lot of sense.
Right, thank you. I have a few questions. I think you answered them on the line of credit. So we would have a one-time cost, and then we would need to pay back with interest over time if we ever used it. But in years where it's just our budget, we would still have some type of reserve. It wouldn't be getting rid of maybe not, but we would still maybe have some type of disaster reserve, so we wouldn't have to access the line of credit. But that's something we could discuss at a later time as we explore the different options of what it is. It's not maybe all or nothing.
Chair Freeman, absolutely. So we would want to go through a robust process to determine what is the appropriate amount of the line of credit that we would want, what's the interest rate, what would be the terms of payment. We'd have to go through a process to determine that. And I suspect that the line of credit would be some amount, but we would still want to, as an organization, keep cash in reserve that would sort of supplement it so it sort of achieves the total of 25% or whatever council determines is the overall policy amount.
Of the contingency and so we'd still have a disaster reserve, a contingency, and a line of credit, maybe all three of them okay. And then next question is, you mentioned on the bonding, so we are going to the police station, and it's one of the largest, if not the largest project we're going to be partaking in the city. So how does it, you said it doesn't necessarily have a direct correlation if we say we were to lower this, but are there any potential risks to it? Let's put it that way, of getting, not getting the highest rating that we would want.
Chair Friedman, again, I do think that there might be some risk. The city does have a very high credit rating today, and we anticipate that continuing through the process of issuing debt. If a rating agency determines that they would like to downgrade the city solely based on that, there are many other factors, though, as I mentioned earlier. The effect of it, the risk of it, is that the interest rate on the issuance of the debt would likely be a little bit higher. That would be sort of the impact, potentially, of it, which means it would just be more expensive to pay back the debt over the term of the issuance. But again, there's no direct correlation, so I can't say that with any degree of certainty.
And then, let me see one other thing. Oh, so the last question I have is related to downtown parking. You mentioned that one in particular, that it is on track as it currently stands to have its reserves depleted maybe by the end of this fiscal year or the next, depending on what takes place over the next year and a half or so. So walk us through what would happen if that fund gets depleted, what the impacts would be to the general fund. Do we have any estimates of what those numbers are, and then what the impacts would be on the general fund?
Chair Friedman, so at this time, I do not have projections readily available on how much that fund would either have fully depleted reserves, or then going forward, all else being equal, how much it will run a deficit year over year. Staff would have to come back. I see staff from Public Works here, but we could come back to you with some updated projections. We would be happy to do so. But what I can tell you is that the impact on the general fund, if that were to occur in the downtown parking fund, is the general fund would have to pick up that difference, meaning that effectively the general fund would have to transfer cash into the downtown parking fund as a sort of as an expense in the general fund and as revenue in the downtown parking fund, so that that fund can balance every year. And so that would be a burden. It would be an additional expense on the general fund to make that fund whole. There is no other funding source, I don't believe, that can do that for the downtown parking fund other than the general fund.
And it could potentially be significant to the general fund, depending on revenues are coming in. We just changed the rates, and there are struggles with downtown, but that could be a significant hit. We're just going to have to monitor how the new rates are going and the usage going forward. Okay. And with that, I don't have any other questions, so I will open it up to public comment. I don't see any in the room. Are there any members online who wish to speak? Please raise your hand in the app.
Chair Friedman, we have nobody online to speak.
All right, so now I'll turn it over to comments, and Member Harmon.
Thank you, Chair Friedman. I guess I'll start by acknowledging that I definitely understand this is a really difficult conversation to make. I think probably particularly from your perspective, Mr. DiMartini, as you look to the future and thinking about responsible, it's not the right word, maybe conservative fiscal planning and how to approach that. And it's been a huge benefit to our city to have this reserve policy in place. I acknowledge that careful planning has served us well. By the same token, for the last couple of years during budget season, we have found ourselves in a position to be going into reserves to fund things that we have articulated as community priorities. And for me, that is not prudent planning either. So if every year we get to budget and we have a fight up there on the dais and then agree to just use reserves to pay for this, well, we're not really respecting our reserve policy anyway. And so for me, I think where I got to, I've always been interested in having this conversation, but particularly through this budget season, became frustrated with the fact that we were doing this really ad hoc decision-making and makes the careful, conservative financial planning that we've been doing in a lot of ways moot or puts it at risk. And so I think that while it's difficult to make the call, if we're going to do it anyway, year after year, then let's change the policy, be upfront, and then we can have a real fulsome discussion about how we want to allocate those funds. So I would say that sort of by way of background, that is what is driving my interest at this moment in time. Generally speaking, I am always, and have been for the last few years, of the mind that we have perhaps gone a little bit too conservative and have been interested in moving forward to make adjustment here. So as a philosophical matter, I'm inclined toward it. And then as a practical matter, the way that our budget discussions have evolved has really pushed me to want to prioritize this conversation. So what would I like to see? I mean, for me, there's no other way to say it than to just say it, I guess. I would like to see us reduce the disaster reserve requirement. I think keeping the contingency reserve as is and reducing the disaster reserve, I had been thinking about this concept somewhere to the tune of 3%, so a reduction of 3%. Is really where I had been thinking about this. Now, that number, I think, can be negotiated. That's something that I'm open to. Like, let's talk a little bit more maybe about what that number really, really means. But I think there are so many priorities that we have articulated as a council, as a community, that we simply don't have the money to pay for, let alone paying our employees what they deserve to be paid, that I think this is a reasonable reasoned path forward for us to continue to provide the kinds of services for our community that they deserve and have come to expect. So I would like to see, I guess as a starting position, a 3% reduction in disaster reserves. I'm interested in that question of how much have the disaster reserves been reduced for, let's say, disasters over the last 10 years. I think that would help me benchmark how appropriate 3 to 5% is. Maybe it turns out 2% is the only, if we're going to do a reduction, that's all that's appropriate. But those numbers would help me benchmark. Now I'm sort of just picking a number out of thin air. But that's really what I'm looking at. I think it's a great option for us in conjunction with that reduction to set up a line of credit. By the same token, if the data bears out that we have never reduced our disaster reserves such that only 5% is left, well, it may not be necessary if we're only reducing by 2 or 3%. So I love that as a fail-safe. I think the numbers will show us whether that's something that we would like to do, but I appreciate that suggestion, and I think to the extent that we have discomfort with any reduction at all, well, let's set it up. I also would be open to, though I'm certainly not advocating for, a sunset provision on this reduction. I would like to see it stay reduced permanently, but I think that there is a world where I could get comfortable with the idea of sunsetting this reduction in, let's say, 5, 8, 10 years, when we have moved past this period where there's a particular crunch for us in paying our employees and paying for some of these essential services that community members have come to expect. So I guess that's my olive branch to folks who I know are in a different position than I am on this issue. I support the request to amend the Harbor Preservation Fund, appreciate bringing that. And I will refrain from making a motion, but would ask my colleagues to consider forwarding to council for discussion the idea of reducing the disaster reserve fund up to 5%, I guess we'd say. I don't know if that's the right way to say it, but thank you.
Thank you, Member Harmon, and I'll give my comments in a second, but I'm a little different than you, but I think you'll be surprised. I think there's a way we could get to somewhere. And you did, and I'll give it back. So, Member Gutierrez, did you have any comments?
No comments, just thank you.
All right, so first I just want to thank staff for putting this together, and I want to thank Member Harmon for raising this issue, because it's an important one to have the discussion, and I know you've raised it in the past, and then actually right before the pandemic, I think, if it was when it first there, and then we kind of understood the need and it went through, so that it's been a long time in the making to have this discussion, but I'm glad we're in a place where we can have this discussion. It shows how we've been able to turn things around in the last year or so. So first, I just, on a bigger picture, I just want to, I agree with what Member Harmon was saying in terms of we have a lot of services that we either haven't provided or have significantly reduced their effectiveness and their from many different departments, whether it's public safety, the parks and recreation, or library, year after year. And so while we're planning for these disaster situations or just revenue volatility, we have these large reserves and we're not providing those services, and the public says, well, what's the point of having all that money in the bank if you're not taking care of the bank, right? Taking care of the services. At the same time, though, we do need to be cognizant that when we run into these unprecedented situations that we're able to continue to provide the services, and I think that's why previous councils came up with this policy over 20 years ago, and it served us well, especially through the Great Recession of 2008 and down 2008, and then through the recent pandemic. So the first thing, one of the things that gives me pause is we're like the state of California, a microcosm in terms of our revenue volatility, more than any other city in the county, in terms that we're heavily reliant on the hotel bed tax. And so our revenues can be high, they're extremely high when they're high and extremely lower when they're lower. So that's just something to keep in mind, and it's hard to forecast that when those events come that reduce the TOT and then subsequently the sales tax. And then I do like having the 2 to 3 month, or 3 month with the 25 of us having that available, so we can continue those services for the 3 months, which is a pretty standard operating practice, 2 to 3 months when I'm looking at all this data. And then the other thing is, it came up, and I think this is an important part of having this discussion because I think it would alleviate some of the pressure, is we had a discussion at council this year of going into Measure C for operational. And fortunately, and I think we all realize that needs to continue to be infrastructure, but we need to find ways to decrease that pressure, because we need to have the operating expenses, whether it's employee salaries and the other programs, so that there isn't that pressure on Measure C, because the further we get away from when it was passed, the likelier it will be to start opening that up, and that's always been the concern with it. So these types of conversations are preempting that from the future, but I just want to put that on the record that this will help us preserve Measure C as it was intended when it was voted in. And then the downtown parking fund, I'd like to get more information on that with the impacts to the general fund and exploring the line of credit. And the other concern I have, before I get to where I think there might be a path for us forward, is especially in 21, if the Congress hadn't passed the ARPA, we would be having a different conversation about the reserves on this. But then on the other hand, we did make it through 08 with this policy with something like ARPA. So to where I think, based on this information and my discussions with you, Mr. DiMartini, first I just want to say I support the Harbor Preservation Fund recommendation and exploring a line of credit, what it would cost to implement it, and what those interest rates would be. And I am open actually to going where I think Councilmember Harmon, you mentioned maybe 22% right now, 3%, but toggling it. And here's the slight difference, but I think it could actually give us a test and to try it out. Is I'm concerned that with the police station coming, that I don't want to change any of our parameters as we're going out. I want us to have the highest, to have everything put forward that gives us the best possible position to get the lowest rates on that. And I agree with you, this last budget cycle, we funded things out of reserves. And so I think maybe if we can do this, and I think we can, based on my understanding, is keep, for the next two years, keep the reserve policy as is, but give a direction during the budget for the next coming budget cycle and the year after, that we are open to going down to the 22% as part of the budget process, if we need to. And the reason is that over the next 2 years, we are looking through the Vision 2030 and potential revenue measures and really understanding our city finances. And we will be in a much better position, I think, 2 years from now. One, if we are able to do a revenue measure next year, and it passes, say it were to pass, that's a much different conversation and on the reserve. So it might be premature to permanently reduce the reserve right now, but I think we can get to that 22% over the next 2 years, the three that you were mentioning. That allows us to continue the work we're doing and come back, and then we'll have more answers to those questions, and we'll also know where we are in terms of revenue, should a measure pass in the coming year and a half or so, if that's something to be, or another revenue comes up. So I'm going to ask if you'd be open to doing that approach.
I'm sorry, I don't quite understand.
So we wouldn't actually recommend changing the actual policy permanently, like you would recommend, but we would give direction to staff for the next 2 years that when they're developing the budget, they could go down to 22% and not call it a deficit. Can you help me explain it, a little more succinct?
Councilmember Freeman, I do think I understand what you mean, if I may. So what I'm hearing is instead of permanently changing the reserve policy target from 25% down to something different, through action of adopting the budget or actually any action that council may take where we're in a deficit mode or when we're below the reserve policy target level, that's allowable. Effectively operating below the reserve policy target for this temporary period of time is what I believe I hear Chair Freeman saying.
So
Purposefully acknowledging that we're doing that. There's language in the reserve policy that says that you can do that, or you can operate below the reserve policy target, but it's important to have a plan to replenish it, and what are we going to do about getting back up to reserve policy? And as long as that's an established period of time, there's a plan to replenish, that language is already in the policy itself.
And the replenishment is as what we're doing now with the Vision 2030 and the Fiscal Sustainability Initiative, but it's also looking at new revenue generators over the next year and a half. So what it does is it doesn't change it because there could be impacts to the bonding or whatever, but it allows when the city administrator goes in, rather than saying you have to have this level of reserve and you're in a deficit if you're not, they can toggle it down for the next 2 years, and then once we have a better understanding, then we can have the full conversation of whether to change it or not.
So So I appreciate the creative thinking. My fundamental problem with that proposal is just that that's what we already are doing. And we already are toggling down because we want to spend money. And the whole purpose of having this conversation is to say, let's be clear about what it is we're doing. You're just, I guess, we're putting a stamp, official imprimatur on the concept of just doing whatever we want anyway. I don't know, it doesn't really solve my fundamental problem. That said, I don't know, could we forward both of these proposals? Because at the end of the day, I think if that's where the votes are for the full council, I would prefer at least that we have a coherent conversation about accepting that we are doing that and that we're toggling down versus, burying our heads in the sand and pretending we're not. So that's sort of like better than nothing to me, but doesn't quite get me where I want to go. Though I do understand where you're coming from. So I don't know if this is doable, but could we send both? I would be very happy to have a full conversation about your proposal. I just would like to have my proposal discussed as well.
Yeah, no, I that's kind of where I figured we might wind up, but I just wanted to put it out there. And the slight difference, just to try to articulate it a little more clearly, is it's not doing what we were already doing, because we would go into each budget cycle saying, this is the reserve at 25%, and if you go in this, you're in a deficit, and at the end, we would say, okay, we're gonna go in a deficit. We would be, over the next 2 years up front, that 22%, that's where we're trying to achieve right now, but we also have the plan to replenish it by looking at the new revenue enhancements, and there is the possibility of some type of revenue measure next year, whatever that might be, and that would go into the plan. And then once we have this year and a half to 2 years behind us, then we would be in a much better position and have all that information. So it's slightly different than what you're saying. It's not just the business as usual. It's like we are actually going out and looking at our revenues and coming up with what they are. But in the interim, based on the reasons you articulated, we do have this problem with the operations of the city of we need to have more operating budget. So that's where I was coming from. So.
Sorry, one additional question, and then we can just move it forward. But are you proposing that we budget as if we have a 22% reserve, or we budget and then if we want to go over, we say, oh, we're not actually in a deficit, it's okay?
I think it's more as the revenues come in and we're getting into April of each year, of next year. If the revenues are coming in and we have the 25% and we go down to 24, we're in a deficit. I think what I'm proposing would actually give the city administrator the ability to toggle it down to 22 when they present the budget to us. So there is some flexibility for them to toggle it down should the revenues and expenditures need that. Rather than holding the line at 25, go through all the budget departments, and then at the very end, we're like, well, we want to fund this, so we're going to deficit fund it. It gives them the ability up front, as we're hearing the department presentations, to say, hey, we can move it down to 22, and so we have that conversation up front rather than at the end, which is what you were referring to.
Yeah, I appreciate that. I mean, we can have more fulsome discussion at the full council. I guess part of wanting to change this requirement would be not so that when we do our planning, I mean, I guess that's where I'm confused. Is the city administrator going to be planning as if we only have 22%, or does she just have to plan as if we have 25 and it depends? I mean, this is the stuff we can talk about with the city administrator when this comes to the full council, and just, I guess, foreshadowing the kinds of questions about this policy that I would have and how that would impact my concerns about ad hoc planning and trying to be sort of coherent. So I appreciate that. I think that's the kind of creative thinking that we need to have to get through this period. So I would be happy to move forward both proposals as stated to full council.
And I'll second that. Any further discussion? Okay, so since there is and we'll take them separately. We'll take that. We'll do a roll call, and then we need to vote on the harbor preservation separately because that's actually a resolution. So, so since the motion's on the floor for both proposals, forward them to council. Can I have a roll call on that?
Yes. Yes, thank you. So the motion was made by Member Harmon and seconded by Committee Chair Freeman to bring staff's recommendation to the full city council for the Harbor Preservation Fund ordinance being repealed, but then also Councilmember Harmon's proposal to consider reducing the disaster reserve level from 15% down to 12%, if I understand, up to 5%, excuse me, if I heard that correctly. But then also another option, as Chair Freeman indicated, which was to give the city administrator the authority of bringing the annual budget proposal, effectively showing a planned reserve policy target level of down to 22% annually, knowing that we are working on Vision 2030 and fiscal sustainability and a number of other initiatives that will ultimately help the city balance its budget in the long term. Okay, great. So roll call vote. Yeah, there we go. We'll start with Committee Member Gutierrez.
Yes.
Committee Member Harmon.
Yes.
Committee Chair Freeman.
Yes.
That motion passes unanimously.
Thank you, everyone, and great discussion. I look forward to having it more at council, and with that, we are adjourned.